Let's briefly talk about this frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about this concept of frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about this concept of frame dragging. Talk about a spinning of frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about this spinning object. Let's briefly talk about this frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about this spinning object. Let's briefly talk about this frame dragging. A spinning object. Frame dragging. Frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about this spinning object. Frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about this frame dragging effect. The effect was frame dragging effect. Let's briefly talk about this concept frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about this concept frame a spinning object. Frame dragging a spinning object. Let's briefly talk. The effect was the frame dragging effect. Something. The effect was something much more extreme. Let's briefly talk about this. Let's briefly talk about something much more extreme. Frame drag. Twisting the fabric of space-time. Frame. Let's briefly talk about this concept of let's briefly talk about something much more extreme. Twisting the fabric of space-time. Frame dragging effect. Frame dragging effect. Let's briefly talk about this. Let's briefly talk about this. Let's briefly talk about this. The mechanics of these engines. The mechanics of these engines. Observe the mechanics. Observing the mechanics of these engines. Frame dragging. Frame dragging. Let's briefly talk about the mechanics of the mechanics. How all this happens. The mechanics of these engines. Frame dragging. The mechanics of these the mechanics. Of the mechanics of let's briefly talk about something much more extreme. Frame dragging. Something much more extreme. Observing this in the black. The mechanics of these engines. Let's see how all this happens. The mechanics of these engines. The frame dragging. The mechanics of these engines. Let's briefly talk about this. The effect was incredible. Let's briefly talk about frame dragging. The effect was incredible. Observing this, the mechanics. Observing this, the effect was incredible. The mechanics of these. The mechanics of these. The mechanics of these engines. Let's briefly talk. Trying to understand this phenomenon is, of course, kind of important.